you for tuning in. Carl Hoffman is on the phone. He is the author of The Last Wild Men of Borneo. It is a true story, an amazing true story. I'm not finished with it. In fact, I just started, so I don't know a whole lot about what goes on in the book. But I found this fascinating so far, and I'm not the only one. It is number one on Amazon in a couple of different categories. Indonesia, literary, specialty travel, nonfiction, of course. Number one across the board there, and getting rave reviews from readers as well, of course. Carl Hoffman, thank you for being on the air with us this morning. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks so much.
The good ones you can't put down, and when you do a talk show, you really kind of have to know what the book is about. So I apologize to all the other authors whose book I'm not going to get to, because I'm going to continue reading yours. How did you hear about this story? How did you know about this in order to write about it?
Well, it's funny. It's a story about two characters, two men, Bruno Mansur from Switzerland and Michael Palmieri from California. And I had been aware of Bruno's story for years. I mean, he'd been super famous in the 90s in particular. And I was sort of pondering his story. I had been in 2012, I had lived in a very remote village in New Guinea as part of researching my previous book, and it had left me with all kinds of crazy questions about indigenous people and how we perceive them. And all that was kind of banging around in my head when I ran into this. I met, just totally by chance, Michael Palmieri, and I was in Bali, and he over some beers, started telling me this crazy story of his life, and I couldn't believe it. I mean, 40 years of going in and out of Borneo, collecting its art that had become incredibly valuable. And then it turns out he had met Bruno, he encountered him once, and suddenly these two stories just came together in my head, and I realized that even though they were very different men, they were really both speaking to the same thing, this Western urge and hunger to kind of get into very wild places.
Wow! So every wannabe author who wants to follow in your footsteps, you got to go to a remote place, find an American in a bar, and have beer, right? So you didn't know each other.
Actually, that's an excellent description. Yes. No, he actually friended me on Facebook originally, just out of the blue. I guess he had read my book, and I didn't really know who he was, but I went to Bali for an event, and I said, hey, let's have a beer, because he sounded kind of interesting, and boom.
Oh, okay. So your reputation preceded you. He was a fan, actually.
He was.
Okay.
And his story opened up so many other stories.
So when you decided to put it into book, you had to get into your journalism mode, right? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, everything happens. It takes a couple years for the book to be written and research. I mean, I went to Switzerland and met Bruno's family. Bruno, I should say, vanished in 2000. So I went through his journals and met his family and friends, and then I moved to Indonesia and made journeys into Borneo in his footsteps, and also with Michael, these two journeys, and those became the spine of the book.
Okay, and it was his disappearance that really catapulted your interest, or is the timeline wrong in my mind?
No, you're correct. I mean, his story is fascinating prior to his disappearance. I mean, he was a guy who went into the deepest recesses of the forest in search of the nomadic hunter-gatherers who lived there, and stayed for 6 years. And during that time, he, walked through the jungle barefoot and spoke their language fluently. And the most important thing is there was this incredible acceleration of logging at the time he was living there. And he kind of organized the Pinan in these blockades that brought logging to billions of dollars of industry to a halt for time, and he became the most wanted man in Malaysia, and was arrested twice and escaped twice under gunfire, and eventually escaped back to Switzerland, but then began sneaking in and out of Borneo, and this all just ratcheted up in this incredibly wild tale until he vanished.
And Michael was more of an entrepreneur because he was more interested in the art and the demand for it.
Yeah, Michael's kind of a buccaneer. I mean, a guy who's made his whole living on the edges and smuggling things back when he was in his 20s, and for the last 40 years dealing in the art of the Dayaks. And so in some senses, these men seem very different. I mean, Bruno was sort of an idealistic do-gooder environmentalist, and Michael was this more of a buccaneer. But I think both of them were inspired by and fueled by the same sort of hunger for indigenous people and for the magic and power we imagine they possess.
And he really did smuggle the crown jewels to Switzerland?
From Afghanistan. So he says, yes.
Do you know, sometimes when I watch the news and I feel like I'm getting addicted to the news, whatever, I think it doesn't really affect me. But sometimes world events, the overall ebb and flow, I guess, to use a metaphor of events, does affect us in one way, and it seems like that's what happened to, at least to Michael in this. The avoidance, I guess you would say, of the Vietnam War, I think contributed to his decision on where to go.
Well, I mean, history affects us all, and Bruno and Michael both. I mean, they both. Bruno was drafted in the Swiss Army, and he refused to go. He was sentenced to prison, and after he got out of jail, he took off, and Michael resisted the draft and took off, and they both ended up at this place at a very specific time in history when, very traditional cultures were being changed by outside forces, and they both got caught up in those outside forces in a way that they never anticipated or meant to, and history was made.
And this was in the 1980s, so it wasn't like we're talking like the 1800s.
No, absolutely. We're talking, the story kind of begins really in the 70s and continues through the, heavily in the 80s and 90s and even today somewhat. I mean, Bruno has vanished, but Michael's still at it.
I hope one day I'm referred to as the last wild man of something. I want to be the last one. I mean, I'm betting they're loving your title. So I have a copy of the book, The Last Wild Men of Borneo. Carl Hoffman is the author. He sent me a nice hardcover copy. If you'd like the copy that was sent to me, I will read mine on Kindle, which I've been doing anyway.
It's ultra interesting.
Call me if you want the actual book that I have here. The rest of us have to go buy it. It is on Kindle. I found it on Amazon. Do you have a website you want to direct us to?
Just my name, carlhoffman.com.
When you find a good story, you probably know instinctively that this is going to be something people will be enjoying. But you have the ability to tell that story, and that's not something everybody's got the gift to be able to do. So I appreciate the fact that you've come on the air to share this with us.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate being here.
Thank you. We will take a little break. We'll be right back. Carl Hoffman, The Last Wild Men of Borneo. We'll be right back.
Embark on a magical night at the Appleton Museum of Art on Saturday, April 14th from 6 till 9 p.m. Follow your book of enchantment around the museum for unicorn carriage rides, magic shows,